There she is. Right.
We need to swap over.
Yes, we do. That's what I wanted. And one more. You push that in. That'll just go in. I can push you in. Push shelf in. Again. Hello.
Okay.
Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our last session before Christmas. I'll say something before we finish, but straight over to Judy.
Yeah, Judy, you're a little bit low on the screen. It's better.
Yeah.
A low slung.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning. And before we start, just to say, I hope you all have a lovely Christmas and a peaceful New Year. Right, the Norman Conquest itself. So we're on familiar ground, I think. Most of us know something about the Norman Conquest, and it might even be where we started. Perhaps if we went to secondary school, that might be where history began, or you might have started with the Romans and then done the Saxons and the Vikings quite quickly, and then moved on to the Norman Conquest, and then chronological from then on. So most people, it's the only date. The joke is that 1066 is the only date they know, and it is an extremely significant date for various reasons. So King Edward the Confessor, often described as our last true Saxon king, died on the 5th of January. So right at the very beginning of 1066, dramatic things were happening. And Martin's found the very crucial illustration of this in the Bayeux Tapestry, showing King Edward on his deathbed. And then one significant thing about the Bayeux Tapestry is that normally it moves along. It's almost like a cartoon. It moves from left to right in picture form. But this is the only scene which then goes from right to left, showing King Edward being buried in Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey being very, very tiny, because they couldn't do proportion or perspective in those days. So a very tiny little, very elaborately shown, illustrated Westminster Abbey with a very large coffin going into it. And according to the Bayeux Tapestry, Harold was created as king while King Edward was dying. It was absolutely made clear that Harold had the king's authority to accept the throne, although he wasn't of royal blood. And if you remember, there were three main contenders. The one with the greatest right to succeed had been sort of voted out by the Witan, by the, you could say most of the wise men of the time, the king's councillors, the king's advisors, the Witan. They had decided that Edgar was just too young. He was only 14. And at a time of crisis and Viking invasions, etc., it wasn't appropriate to have a young lad as the next king of England, particularly as he'd been brought up abroad. He didn't really know very much about England at all. So he was eliminated, and that left 3 contenders. So the argument then took place, you know, who was the rightful king? Was it Harold? Was it Harold Hardrada, King of Norway? Or was it William, Duke of Normandy, who powerfully believed that he'd been promised the throne and that Harold had taken an oath of loyalty on an unexpected visit to Normandy? So there were 3 contenders, and very neatly, 3 battles of significance in 1066. Most of us only know about Hastings, but there were in fact 3 important battles fought in that 1 year, which makes it significant in any case, even if there hadn't been a change of dynasty and a complete change of ruler and organization and everything else. 1066 would still be famous because you don't have many years where there are 3 sort of civil war battles. You might have 3 battles in a European war or a conflict of some sort, but not in this case. It's unusual. Fulford, Stamford Bridge, and Hastings, 3 significant battles for the crown. So one important factor, which some people say is very suspicious, people who don't believe that Harold Godwinson gained the crown honourably, was the fact that he was so quick to get his coronation organised. It was the sort of following day. How can you organise a coronation by the following day? Well, anyway, he did. King Edward died, and the next thing people knew, they got a new king and he'd been crowned. It wasn't the crowning that was so significant, it was the anointing. Anointing was like a blessing from God. The holy oil was very, very significant, very important indeed, far more significant than just putting the crown on the king's head. That gave the king more than just a temporal role. He became a sort of spiritual leader as well as a temporal leader. And so some people have regarded this, the haste, with great suspicion. They are saying to themselves, well, why is Harold in such a hurry to get himself crowned and anointed? Is it because he knows that he's taken this binding oath of loyalty to his rival, William of Normandy? And so he's trying to gain a spiritual advantage, which would be very, very important in those days, the days of when people were very superstitious and very afraid of the wrath of God. The next thing that happened, apart from this very, very quickly organised coronation, was that 2 earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, challenged his authority. And he then did a very clever thing. He married their sister, Edith. Women in those days were sort of expendable and sort of usable in this way. They didn't seem to have any rights at all. They were just sort of used for alliances and, well, for alliances basically, and to cement friendships. So that was rather, that showed that Harold was a cunning kind of man. It was a sensible move, and it worked very well indeed, that he married Edith. She became his queen. Then we've got the rogue card. We've got Tostig, who had quarrelled with his brother, so another of Harold's brothers. It was a big family. Tostig had turned traitor. And Tostig invaded England and was defeated in battle, but lived, and then decided that he was going to make a pact with another of the contenders, Harold Hardrada. So he has become a complete traitor. He's fighting against his brother, who he detests. And Harold Hardrada set sail for England in September 1066, sails up the Humber, which is absolutely massive, as you know, massive estuary, then sails up the Ouse, which is also a very, very large river, and reaches York, which is the capital of the Danelaw, Jorvik. And there was then a battle on the 20th of September called the Battle of Fulford, which is just outside York. And the Norwegian army succeeded. Now, it is a sort of hidden battle. It's hardly known about, possibly because the Norwegians won. I mean, it's not anything to feel very proud about. The fact that the Saxon army was defeated, the English army was defeated, the Norwegians were triumphant. So this is looking good for Harold Hardrada, because York surrendered, and the victorious army then moved to Stamford Bridge, and they ate and they drank and they celebrated, a little bit like the Argentinians. They were sort of happy with their success and relaxed. Always a mistake. It's like counting chickens, it's sort of assuming that all is well instead of keeping their guard up. Because very, very quickly, surprisingly quickly, Harold of England, King Harold, managed to move his army by forced march, by making them eat as they were marching and hardly have any rest, marched them from the south to the north, and a great battle took place, which you probably have heard of, Stamford Bridge. And because the Norwegians were taken unawares, and because they'd been celebrating and probably got hangovers, and certainly been eating rather a lot, so they weren't, you know, in fighting condition. And they were just very, very surprised indeed to see the English army appear, because they didn't know the lie of the land, and they thought that down south was so far away that they weren't really considering the possibility of an army reaching them. But Harold of England was a great leader, and he had encouraged his men to literally sort of go the extra mile, to march further than they'd ever marched before in one day, and to say, eat as they marched, hardly had any rest at all, and arrived. And the battle was a success for the English. They defeated the Norwegians. A very famous incident took place where somebody went underneath the bridge and stabbed one of the leaders, kind of with the spear coming up through the wooden bridge, and stabbing him and killing him and throwing his body into the river. It was said that the river was red with blood, absolutely red. And one of the little tributaries was called Red Brook for many. I think it still is called Red Brook, because it literally was running red with Norwegian blood. So many men were killed and their bodies thrown into the water. So that was very, very dramatic. So what had been a victorious army was now a defeated army. And from our Harold's point of view, from the King of England's point of view, total triumph, because Harold Hardrada was killed in the battle, and so was Evill Tostig. And there was absolutely no love lost between the brothers, so Harold was actually delighted that his brother was dead. And we can't really blame him for that, because his brother was a traitor. Now, during all this time, or while all this had been going on, William of Normandy had thrown his hat into the ring. He was convinced that he was the rightful King of England. He said he'd been promised by King Edward, and that the promise had been ratified by Harold. And that scene is shown very clearly on the Bayeux Tapestry. That King Harold, sorry, not Harold then, Harold of Wessex, Earl Harold, spent time in Normandy, and the Bayeux Tapestry clearly shows William of Normandy and Earl Harold, hunting together and hawking together, and apparently like new best friends. And then the famous scene, which we talked about last time, where William is sitting on a throne, well, a very posh chair, sort of throne, and there's this mysterious, well, not mysterious, there's an altar and a box on a stand. And Harold is shown with his hand, one hand on the altar and the other hand on the box, which is closed, making a promise. And the promise is that when King Edward dies, that he, Harold, will support his rival's claim. He will renounce his own claim and support that of William of Normandy. And when he'd taken the oath, servants then reveal that in the mysterious closed box that Harold put his hand on were relics of saints, bones and belongings of saints, which made it not just a promise, but a binding oath taken before God. And again, there's this suspicion, well, if you wanted him to take an oath on relics, why didn't you show him the relics beforehand? Why put them in a closed box? In other words, it was a sort of trick. It's underhand. Why not explain that you are taking this oath, just to be clear, you're taking this oath on sacred relics, your relics of saints. Your oath is before God himself. Are you happy with that? I mean, that's what they'd say nowadays, isn't it? Are you happy with that? Is that all right? But they didn't. It was only afterwards that they showed the relics. So there's something underhand there. So that's regarded with some suspicion by people at the time and people since. Why was there the need for secrecy and deception? So while Harold Hardrada was able to invade because the wind was blowing to the south, from the north to the south, so his ships were able to land in this country and invade. Of course, the opposite was true for William of Normandy, who, as the Bayeux Tapestry shows, had created a fleet, got all his horses ready, got everything ready. That shows very clearly on the Bayeux Tapestry. Everything was in readiness. We could see food being loaded on board the ships, etc. But the wind was in the wrong direction for weeks and weeks and weeks. The wind was blowing from south, in the southerly direction, and that was no good for William of Normandy. He wanted the wind blowing the other way, from south to north, to get him across the channel. Some people have said, well, why couldn't they row all the way? Well, not with all the gear they were bringing. The ships were very heavily laden, and they got horses on board, so they couldn't really row all the way across the channel. And it's tricky anyway, as we know from recent developments. The channel might only be 21 miles, but it is very, very tricky navigationally because of all the currents, and it just wouldn't have been feasible. So William of Normandy had made all his preparations. He was, as I say, good to go. His army were all built on D-Day landings. His army was ready. Very tricky keeping horses in readiness for that long time. Becoming more and more impatient, and seeing his opportunity being snatched away at first by Harold Hardrada, thinking, oh, I've totally missed out, my throne has been snatched away by the King of Norway. Then the good news that the King of Norway had been killed, but then the wind still wasn't going in the right direction. But then suddenly it changed, and William was able to land his forces. Quite amazingly, when you think they were carrying horses in open ships. But anyway, and then because Harold and his army were in the north, hundreds of miles away from Hastings, or Pevensey, which is where they landed, Pevensey in Sussex, it was the Norman army that were able to relax and prepare in a very organized kind of way. There was no need to hurry because Harold was way up north with an exhausted army. They'd done the route march up north, the forced route march. They'd fought a battle. Many of them were wounded. not seriously, but they were nursing their wounds, hoping to have time to recover. Now they were going to have to march all the way south and take on the Normans. And the beauty, well, from the Norman point of view, the beauty of this was that they had plenty of time to acclimatise and recover from their sea journey. And the Bayeux Tapestry clearly shows them eating nice food. There's chickens on spits. It's looking very familiar. Lots of nice food being eaten. The horses being exercised. That's shown on the Bayeux Tapestry. They even had time to build some temporary castles, also shown on the Bayeux Tapestry. They were relaxed and simply waiting for their enemy to turn up. And poor Harold had again to force exhausted troops for, it was over 200 miles, to march to the south coast to fight another enemy. And that's why it took such a long time back. It was October the 14th, and King Edward had died in January. It was a very, very long, drawn-out conquest, in other words. It didn't just happen overnight, as some people, we perhaps remember from school, that it happened really quickly, and it didn't. The country was in crisis all that time. And the Battle of Hastings is falsely named because it's actually the Battle of Senlac Hill, 7 miles away. The actual battle took place. Hastings was the nearest settlement. And again, the Normans had time to choose an appropriate battlefield. They'd ridden around the area and they'd chosen a field. Battlefields are called battlefields for no reason. They chose a field with a hill at one end, which actually gave an advantage to the Saxons, the way they fought, the English, which we'll mention in a minute. But the main thing about this field was that it got woodland on either side and the sort of soggy bit in the middle, where there was a spring and a little stream, and it was marshy. And a hill at one end. And it shows, they say the Bayeux Tapestry shows very clearly the Normans sort of searching out this, looking for this appropriate battlefield, and deciding that they had found just the place because of the way. Well, as we come to the battle, you'll see what their strategy was, or their battle plan was. Different ways of fighting. The Normans used cavalry. And they fought, both sides had the same, interestingly, both sides had the same kind of protective gear. They both got chainmail and helmets with nose pieces, and the helmets are very similar. So when the battle starts, it's quite hard to see which side is which, except for the way they fight, the way they're dressed. And they didn't wear sort of colours like people do today, or particular uniforms. They wore protective gear, which was chainmail. So it's a little bit hard to tell one from the other in terms of not wearing special uniforms and not wearing special colours even. But they did fight in different ways. The Saxons, the word Saxon actually comes from seax, which is their battle axe, which is two-sided. Not just like a chopper, but two-sided axe with the blade on both sides. And the Saxon way of fighting was to find a hill, not necessarily a hill, but to form a shield wall. If they could find a hill, better still, make their enemy fight uphill. Shield wall, they sort of borrowed the idea from the Romans, it's thought. The Romans had straight-sided shields, slightly curved, and they could build a very effective wall by putting the shields edge to edge. Saxons, the shields weren't the same shape, but they could still form a very effective shield wall, which was virtually impenetrable. They then moved forward. The Romans had called it a tortoise because it was like a tortoise, it was like a shell. Moving forward to attack the enemy, then obviously they didn't keep the shield wall there all the time, but they could, if they chose, they could make their enemy come and attack them. They would take their shields apart and then lash out with their double-headed axes. It was a very effective way of fighting. The shield wall, very, very important. The Normans didn't fight like that. They depended very much more on their cavalry. And the cavalrymen used maces or clubs and swords, daggers if necessary, and threw spears. Both sides had archers. Both sides had infantrymen, archers, the foot soldiers. And the Saxons were delighted when they got there. I mean, they were absolutely exhausted. Saxons, English, Harold's army, exhausted, but determined that they were going to fight for their man. So it's very much on a personal level that the Normans were fighting for their man. They were fighting for William. William had very cleverly introduced another element, so it wasn't just loyalty to him that was going to motivate his men. He promised them land. He promised that if he won, he would distribute the land confiscated from the Saxon noblemen, and he would give it to them as a reward. So a powerful motive to fight well and to win. The Saxons were fighting for their leader, even though he wasn't royal. He had great leadership qualities, and they were loyal. Tostig the rat brother, the army, they were loyal to Harold. He had great leadership qualities, and had successfully commanded his men up until then. They had followed him faithfully. But another problem, which from several weeks before, was that the agreement with the Saxon agreement was that if men were needed on their farms to collect in the harvest, they only had to fight for 2 months, and then if the farm demanded their presence, then that was part of their contract. They were allowed to go home and do whatever was necessary on the farm, collecting the harvest, which was later then than it is today. Harvest now is often August, and it was sort of September, October in those days, depending on the weather. It was a sort of movable feast, depending on weather conditions. So Harold had lost the numbers are not clear actually, but a considerable number of men had been allowed by the system that applied. They weren't doing anything dishonorable. They'd gone home to look after their harvest, because obviously they were going to starve in the winter. You know, the harvest, they were self-sufficient farmers, they were peasants. So that was another issue. So King Harold had to force march his army all the way from the north down to the south coast. And they did find the hill, they found Sandlag Hill, and they did create a shield wall. And the housecarls, the noblemen, were the sort of bodyguard, if you like, the ones that actually protected the king. But the king fought. Some people said, oh, well, he was sort of protected by their job was to protect him, but the king actually did lead his army. He was in command. He was the organizer, the commander, the one that was saying what to do next. So Harold fought in the battle very, very bravely. The Normans occupied the field below the hill. And they fought with spears, maces, and swords. The Saxons fought with war axes. Both sides had archers. And the Norman strategy, the only one they could use, was to try and dislodge the shield wall. And they tried again and again, riding up the hill. In the Bayeux Tapestry, the designers of the tapestry didn't know how to do the hill, so they just did a sort of scallop effect, which indicates the hill. So if you ever get a chance to look at the pictures of the Bayeux Tapestry, where you see this funny sort of scallopy effect, that's the hill. They couldn't show that. They did show the hill in some of the pictures, but they cheated a bit to get it all in. They didn't understand about perspective, so they just used this sort of scalloping on the flat, as though it was flat. But that actually indicates that the Saxons were maintaining the discipline of their shield wall, which was kind of impenetrable. And every so often they surged out. They didn't come down off the hill. They waited for the cavalry, the Normans to attack them, and then they smashed them with their axes. So even though the English forces were exhausted, and many of them still suffering from slight wounds from the Battle of Stamford Bridge, it was not, by no means a pushover for the Normans, even though they'd been there for weeks resting and so forth. It was a very hard fought battle. And the Normans tried again and again to trick the English into coming off their hill. And it didn't work. But then finally, probably because both sides were tiring, the Normans, then there was the crisis that they thought that William was dead. And some of the Normans looked as though they were about to give up because their leader was dead and no point in fighting any longer. And then in the Bay of Tapestry clearly shows William tipping his helmet back and revealing his face and shouting, here I am, I'm all right, carry on fighting, guys. I'm here, I'm not dead, I'm not even injured. So a very dramatic moment. So the Normans used something that they had already used, and it had failed. They pretended to be defeated, shouting, presumably in French, let's leave the field, they are too strong for us, we must surrender. And off they rode into the woodland either side of this field. And the English, were becoming exhausted by this time. Both sides were becoming very, very tired indeed. The battle had been going on for hours and hours by this time. Did what leaders always say don't do. They lost their discipline and they came running down from their from their hill to chase after what they thought were the defeated Normans. And of course the Normans weren't defeated at all. They were hiding in the woodland either side of the battlefield. And when they'd sort of lured the English forces off the hill onto the flat ground, they came out of the woods, and of course either side, so they surrounded the English warriors. Plus they tried to drive them into the marshy area so that they'd be sort of bogged down in the mud. So clever, and it worked. The English got very excited, were convinced that the Normans were defeated, and came rushing down off the hill, despite the fact that Harold knew it was a trick. He and his housecarls stayed firm. That Bay of Tapestry shows that, fighting to the end and saying it's a trick, come back, form the shield wall again. It's a trick. Too late. The Normans came out of the woods, surrounded the Saxons, and it was a bloodbath. Or they ran, or they escaped. They ran away. Then we've got the very dramatic end of Harold, very famous picture which Martin has found and illustrated for us. Very famous picture which appears to show Harold with a green shield and plain green, we'll say stockings, pulling an arrow out of, it appears to be going into his eye. Now, they didn't say that immediately after the battle. This idea that he was killed by an arrow in his eye appeared many years later and was then repeated by various chroniclers. And the suspicion grew in the 19th century when the Tapestry was involved in a sorry, before the 19th, there was a fire, and nuns were asked to mend the tapestry, which had got burned and damaged. Not horribly damaged, but it needed sewing. And that there was a split in the linen, just at the crucial picture of Harold, apparently with an arrow in his eye, and his hand is up as if he's pulling the arrow out of his face. And if you look at the back of the tapestry, there's a tuck where the nuns have pulled the fabric together because it's split and sewn it up. And the arrow, if it wasn't for this tuck, would just be going into his helmet. And he's pulling it out because it's in his line of vision, but it hasn't hurt him. It's not gone into his face. It's higher up. So because it's had to be mended, the arrow appears to be lower down and going into his eye. So that's one issue. The other issue is that the Latin commentary says Harold Rex interfectus est. Harold the king is cut down. Now, an arrow in the eye is not cutting down. But behind, we'll say, if it isn't Harold, then the guy with the green shield and the plain socks, there is somebody with stripy socks being cut down by a Norman cavalryman. Very dramatic picture of the Norman leaning forward with a huge sword and stripy socks man falling and letting go of his axe, which is only a single-headed axe actually. And he's falling. He is being cut down. So many historians believe that the story that they believe that the story about the arrow in the eye is a legend or inaccurate, and that Harold was actually killed, as many of the chroniclers described at the time, being cut down first of all by one cavalryman, by one Norman on horseback, and then when people realized what was happening, others came. And he was hacked very, very badly. He was hacked to not completely to pieces. Another piece of evidence is that if you go to Bisham Abbey, which is also shown on the tapestry, Bisham Church, I'm sorry, it was an abbey, but it's now a church. They've got a leg, which they have buried with due honours. They've got a whole person, they've got a leg. And the story is that it was Harold's leg, which is why it was, collected and buried with due honour. That he was therefore hacked to pieces. And this is quite logical, that they would want to be absolutely sure that the King of England, the assumed King of England, was really dead. Because as you probably know, over centuries and in many different countries, there are stories about kings and leaders not really being dead, being hidden in a cave somewhere, or being revived by nuns in a convent, coming back at some stage to take over the country. The reluctance of people to accept that a leader is dead is widespread. Even people who are not royal, like Drake, the belief that Drake would come back, Francis Drake would come back to rescue this country if it ever got into trouble, and there's sort of songs about it, sea shanties about it. Drake's drum will sound when the country is in danger. Drake is still alive somewhere. King Arthur was still alive and would come back and rescue everybody. King Alfred, there were legends that he was still alive. Also, this is a sort of, and it happens in many countries, that a great leader doesn't die. They're hidden away somewhere. They've been rescued. So that's why if somebody died in battle, they made very, very sure that they were dead. It sounds totally horrible now, that they were not just pierced through the heart once and died. They made very sure indeed that they weren't going to come back and claim the throne or claim leadership again. An interfectus est does mean cut down. Arrow in eye doesn't mean cut down. However, modern historians say, well, why can't it be both? Why can't it? The only problem with that is that they're quite clearly two different people in the picture because they're wearing different socks. It's not quite significant that they are wearing different socks. So it isn't the same person shown twice. There's no reason why that shouldn't happen. I mean, the tapestry does take liberties every so often. But they're two different people. So some people have said, oh, well, we'll sort of hedge our bets. We'll have him, first of all, injured with an arrow in his eye. And then he can be cut down, which fits with the commentary and fits with what the chroniclers first described. The arrow in the eye story only came later. And even then, they hadn't, that was before the fire had sort of made a difference to the actual picture, that the nuns had mended the tapestry. They'd actually pulled the fabric together so that the arrow is more sinister going. But he isn't falling down actually in the picture where the arrow's in the eye. He looks as though he's just taking something out that's a nuisance. He's not sort of crumbling, is he? He's not crumbling to the ground or anything. But the other guy is actually falling down. Another clue is that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the fact that the king's body was so mutilated that after the battle, it couldn't be identified until they sent for the king's mistress. And she was able to identify the body by certain marks which only she knew about, which does sound quite convincing. She was able to identify the body. Other people had said, oh no, this is just a romantic myth. On the other hand, if somebody had been very, very badly slashed at by swords and daggers, they probably would be unrecognisable. And there's no doubt that Harold's body was finally identified and buried at the scene, for a time anyway. So the conquest was actually decided on the field of battle. Once the Saxons or English knew that their king was dead, there was no point in continuing to fight. There really wasn't any point. They fled the field and just waited to see what was going to happen next. Well, what was going to happen next was that William, who had waited such a long time on tenterhooks to be King of England, acted very decisively. He rode to Wallingford. He made his way kind of slowly to London, making it very clear who was boss. There was no sense of William being conciliatory or trying to combine his forces or his men with the residents of this country. There was absolutely no question of that. He had come to take over and show who was the new boss. And he did that by fear and by cruelty. From the word go, an extremely ruthless character. Burning, pillaging, taking hostages, stealing goods and chattels to feed his army. And he embarked on a very destructive march through Surrey and Hampshire, burning and pillaging as they went. In other words, a terror campaign. Submit or it will the worst for you. The Normans then went to Winchester. Very important that they should capture the crown jewels, we'd call them today, which were kept at Winchester because that was the capital of Wessex. And so that was the still regarded as the centre. London was the capital really, but Winchester was also very, very special because it had been the capital of Wessex. So captured the crown jewels, the crown, the sceptre, etc. And then decided he was going to have his coronation on a very significant day, Christmas Day, which does sound almost sacrilegious, but again, illustrates how determined he was, how William had total confidence in his own judgment. There was indignation from Saxon bishops saying this is sacrilegious, this is Christ's day. But William knew what he was doing. He was making an impression. He was starting as he meant to carry on. People must submit. They must accept him, or it would be the worst for them. And an example of this was that he went ahead with his coronation, and that is shown on the tapestry very clearly. That when the Archbishop of Canterbury, asked for acclamation, do you accept this man as your king? And there was then a shout of acclamation. The people outside shouted, and it was believed that they were rioting because they were English, and it was believed that they were going to cause trouble. And so the king gave orders that the knights, the Norman security guard, you might say, outside Westminster Abbey, would set fire to the houses belonging to these people. I mean, a wicked thing to do, on Christmas Day of all days, his coronation day. No, absolutely no question of him trying to be friendly to the English. They were to recognize themselves. Our ancestors had been conquered, and they'd got to submit and accept Norman rule. He was showing that there was no idea of friendship or working together. The Saxons were conquered and must accept that fact. So buildings were set on fire. He refused to listen to the explanation that he'd made an awful mistake and that the people were actually acclaiming him. They had submitted. They were agreeing that he was the new king. That made no difference. The houses were alike. Because they were made of wattle and daub and thatch, there was no way of rescuing them. There was no fire service in those days, so the buildings were burnt to the ground. No, they don't record any loss of life, but loss of belongings, loss of food and belongings, and people then begging for their food. Our ancestors didn't submit, even with all this cruel behavior being demonstrated. Our ancestors didn't submit. It took 5 years of brutal campaigning before people began to acknowledge William as the true King of England, and then it was given grudgingly. He was never loved, obviously, having behaved as he did. William kept his promise. The land was taken off the Saxons, totally, again, quite ruthlessly, no discussion, just taken from them and given to his supporters. So by the time of the Domesday Book, which of course is the second absolutely brilliant, most wonderful primary source material that we've got, it's absolutely fantastic. You know, the Domesday Book is still being investigated. It's still revealing secrets because it's all being computerized now, and scholars are still finding things that they hadn't realized before. It's such a rich sort of material, but it does give us a picture of this country 20 years after the Norman conquest, and that reveals that only 4 Saxon noblemen of 4,000, only 4 still held land. All the rest had their land confiscated and had been redistributed to Norman landholders. And we've still got the Norman names incorporated into our aristocracy: Devereux, Beauchamp, Beauchamp, Pretty Field or Beautiful Field, Grosvenor, Beaumont, Beautiful Hill. We've still got these old names and funny pronunciations of some of the aristocratic names. You probably remember Captain Mannering saying it's Mannering, it's not Mainwaring, it's Mannering. in in Dad's army. It's Mannering, it's not Mainwaring. Why isn't it Mainwaring? Because these names were French, and French pronunciation was nothing like German pronunciation. Saxon's a German language, Anglo-Saxon, and the Normans spoke French, although they were descended from Vikings themselves, they spoke French. So even the languages were totally disparate. What did the Normans introduce? They introduced the new feudal system, whereby everyone had an overlord. There was a sort of very, very specific pecking order. I'm sure you can remember learning that at school, the feudal system. A variety of obligations from the highest to the lowest. The king was the top of the pecking order, obviously, but even he referred to God as his overlord. So God, then the king, then the aristocracy, and so on down to the humble peasants. And those are the people we're descended from, the humble peasants. The Saxons had a system, but it was nothing like as strict and as restrictive as the feudal system. The feudal system, as we remember it and we learned about it, was Norman. The new system of landholding. Everybody owed obligations to their overlord. Either work, medieval peasants had to work 3 days a week for nothing for their lord. It was almost like slavery. 3 days a week they had to do the lord's farm work, and then they had 3 days left to do their own work, and Sunday was the day of rest. They also owed feudal obligation to fight whenever the lord wanted an army. Then you had to leave your farm, and it wasn't like it had been in Saxon times where you had a kind of contract and you could go home and do your farming as well. No, the new system was, if your lord wants you to fight, then you fight. You don't have there's no argument about it. You don't try and make a bargain with him or sign a contract. You have to fight. So the new feudalism was, most people were unfree serfs or villeins. They belonged to the village and they belonged to their overlord. He could command them. They weren't exactly slaves, but they weren't free either. Some kind of halfway house situation. And that's where, well, unless we've got hidden ancestors we don't know about who sort of own land and we've fallen on hard times at some point during our unknown ancestry. We are descended from the hoi polloi. We're descended from the peasant class. A new word, chivalry, from cheval, French word for a horse. The code of knightly behavior. A lot of people were thinking we haven't seen much of that actually. All we've seen is people being very cruel, setting fire to houses, stealing food, taking hostages, doing all sorts of negative, evil things. What's this code of chivalry? Well, there was such a thing, and it was mainly, it's a bit like the Geneva Code. It was the Geneva Convention, a code of conduct mainly for warriors. Like you don't kill an unarmed man. If he surrendered his weapons, you shouldn't kill him. If you take a prisoner, you should feed him and eventually return him to his family, etc. And you don't kill unarmed people like monks and women and children and very old people, you'd be glad to know. You mustn't kill people who can't defend themselves. It was broken all the time, of course, but there was a code of chivalry, and it was Norman. And that's why the word chivalry comes from the French. What else did the Normans do? Well, it is true that they brought their building techniques, and they built massive stone buildings, castles and cathedrals, very much to overawe the English. It was kind of deliberately, they built on a huge scale for psychological reasons, to overawe the people in this country who could build in stone. It's not true that the Saxons were still building in wood. They could build in stone, but not on such an enormous scale. And for a long time, there were two separate languages in this country. The two didn't mix together for a long time. The rich and professional classes spoke Norman French, and there's still hints of that in our law system. There are still some sort of French expressions. The underdogs, that's us, spoke Saxon English, and over time they melded together, and we will do that sort of after Christmas, because the development of our language is fascinating. We've ended up with the richest language, some people say in the world, but certainly in Europe, because we've got different words, we've got synonyms, so many synonyms for one thing. Some of the words derived from our Saxon ancestry, and some words derived from French, and some from Latin. We have a very, very rich language, very rich indeed, something we should be proud of. Forest law. This was a very unpleasant development. The Saxons had valued forest because it was hunting land and full of animals, more animals than we've got. They've got wolves. Not that you want to hunt wolves particularly, but not to eat them anyway. Deer were the important things, deer, and for ordinary people, rabbits and hares. So deer and boar were the ones that the aristocrats wanted to hunt. King William brought in new rules, new laws. 21 areas in this country were under forest law, which was very, very harsh indeed. So red and fallow deer, roe deer and wild boars, plus hares and wolves, were protected by these new royal decrees, because we're talking before Parliament. The most famous was the New Forest, which is one of the oldest forests, but ironically called New because it was brought under the forest law by King William. Ordinary people couldn't catch any of the animals for their own use. They couldn't bear hunting weapons. Dogs were banned. People who lived in these forests were under very, very, very severe restrictions, and the forest laws were very, very unpopular. They made the Normans more hated possibly than anything else, because people suddenly found terrible restrictions placed on their freedom. You know, they'd lived there for a very long time, and then suddenly there were these awful laws that they couldn't catch the animals that they'd been used to catching for the pot, like rabbits and hares, and they couldn't anymore because it was designated prime hunting land for the aristocracy, for the king and his mates. And that just seems so horribly unfair. And if they found a dog that was banned, then they damaged its paws so that it couldn't run anymore. They did something horrible to its paws, kept the dog alive, but pulled its claws out and damaged its paws so it couldn't run, which is horrible, isn't it? So we've got a complete change of dynasty, a complete change in terms of rules and regulations, and our ancestors didn't settle down. You'll be glad to know. They didn't accept Norman rule straight away, not by any means. There were rebellions and uprisings. Henry the Wake, for example, in East Anglia. The North, particularly restless. Interesting, because that was the Danelaw. You'd have thought they would have settled down, because the Normans were actually Vikings under new management. But you'd have thought that the people of the Danelaw would have said, well, these are our relatives. We'll accept what's happened. No, the North was very, very, very difficult to control. But finally, 4 years after the conquest, the king decided on an awful sort of retribution. It was a sort of reprisal for the fact that they wouldn't settle down and they weren't paying their taxes properly. It was called the Harrying of the North. And harrying was a sort of dramatic word meaning an over-the-top punishment for people being recalcitrant and disobedient and disloyal. So the harrying of the North meant that the Norman troops rode up to the north, and they burnt houses, they destroyed crops, and they left people to starve. Massive starvation. They burnt crops, they stole the animals. Sometimes they stole the crops, but they also set fire to them as an example of, look what we can do. We are the powerful ones. You have got to submit. And if you don't, you're just going to be, well, almost thrown to the wolves, because there were wolves around then. They certainly weren't extinct until the 14th century. Well, not extinct, but driven away. Well, there weren't any wolves after the 14th century, but there were still wolves at this time. People just starving on hillsides with nothing. You know, their clothes had been destroyed. Their extra clothes. They just got what they, you know, it's just a really, really horrible thing to do. The harrying of the north. Some people used to think that it was exaggerated, that people had gone, you know, over the top describing how dreadful it had been, and that it wasn't that bad. When you look at the Doomsday returns, and you look at all the villagers listed, many villagers in the north just had one word, horrible word, written against them. Villages that were flourishing in the time of King Edward, that was a sort of abbreviated phrase used, in the time of King Edward, because what the king was doing, or new king, William, was trying to work out how valuable his country was in terms of taxation. And so he wanted to know what people had paid in the time of King Edward, and how much the land had been worth in the time of King Edward, compared with 20 years later when he was king. Many villagers just had the one word, waste, W-A-S-T-E, written against them. The name of the village, the owner of the village at the time of King Edward, who was called Saxon, the new owner of the village, the new landowner, and then the word waste, meaning no crops, no houses, no people. Isn't that awful? Many villages, waste. Some of them did eventually revive, but that's why the Doomsday Book is so valuable. It's a sort of snapshot of this country after the Norman conquest, how different it was from before the conquest, how much had changed, and not for the better. So it wasn't just a new dynasty, it was a whole new way of life. And somebody, I've just started watching a new program, PBS, which is American, but weirdly, they've got top British historians doing the program. So presumably our American friends are watching English history with great interest. And they've just done the Norman conquest, and one of the historians said it was the greatest change in our history, greater than the Civil War, greater than the Reformation, greater than the 2 world wars, that the impact of the Norman conquest of 1066 was the most dramatic change in our entire history. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. And then after the holiday, which I hope you'll all enjoy, be safe and well and healthy, we'll go into more detail and do a bit more about the language, which is quite an interesting way of, I know it's not about individuals, but it is interesting to follow up what's happened to our language, and which words are Saxon and which words are Norman and which words are Latin. So I hope you have a lovely holiday, and see you in the new year, all being well.
Thank you, Judy.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you, Judy. Happy Christmas.
Thank you,
Martin.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Judy.
Martin,
Thank you, Martin.
Judy. Happy Christmas to you both.
Start again on the 9th of January. And thank you to Judy for all the work.
Yes, thank you.
Martin.
Have a lovely Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.